The coffee in my hand had gone cold by the time I noticed him staring at the bouquet. I'd been at Harrow and Vane Capital for 2 years, 7 months, and 16 days. Not that I'd been counting. It's just what happens when your entire job requires you to track time with the precision of an air traffic controller. I knew the exact date, because it was the same week I'd finally stopped flinching every time Stellan Harrow's shadow crossed my desk. He was the kind of man who entered rooms the way weather systems did. You didn't notice him arrive so much as you noticed the shift in pressure. 41 years old, third-generation private equity, the sort of quiet wealth that had never needed to announce itself. I'd taken the position straight out of my MBA program, convinced I'd last 6 months and use it as a stepping stone. 2.5 years later, I was still there, and I'd long since stopped pretending I knew why. My name is Serena Cho, and this is the story of how a stranger's flowers changed everything, including things I hadn't realized needed changing. The bouquet arrived on a Thursday. White peonies, pale green hydrangeas, a few stems of something small and delicate I later learned were called sweet peas, wrapped in craft paper, tied with a ribbon the color of sage. Whoever had assembled it knew what they were doing. It wasn't a drugstore arrangement. It was considered intentional. The card was brief. For the one who makes even Monday mornings worth showing up for. No signature. The receptionist had left it on my desk while I was in the copy room. When I returned and found it there, my first reaction was confusion. My second was the warmth that crept up my neck, equal parts flattered and embarrassed. I didn't have a boyfriend. I wasn't seeing anyone. My social life had essentially reduced itself to bi-weekly dinners with my college roommate Bex, and the occasional Sunday farmer's market trip where I bought vegetables I then forgot to cook. I'd barely touched the card before I heard it. What is that? Not a question. Stellan Harrow didn't ask questions the way most people did. He stated them, flat and deliberate, like facts he was choosing to verify. I looked up. He was standing in the doorway of his office, briefing folder in hand, looking at the peonies the way you look at a smoke alarm going off in a building you know isn't on fire. Technically fine. Annoying regardless. A delivery, I said, keeping my voice even. It was here when I got back from the copy room. For you, apparently. His jaw shifted, just slightly, the way it did when he was sassing something he hadn't accounted for. Do you know who sent it? No card with a name, just a note. He said nothing for a moment. Then, I need the Wexford deck by 11. He turned and went back into his office, and the door didn't close behind him. It never did, because he operated on the assumption that he should be able to see me at all times. But something about the set of his shoulders had changed. I told myself I was imagining it. I was wrong. The rest of the morning passed the way mornings usually did. Conference calls I scheduled, and then sat outside listening to Through the Glass Wall. Documents I routed, reviewed, and flagged. A lunch order I placed for a 12:30 meeting with 3 fund managers from Chicago who all wanted different things, and one of whom had a nut allergy I'd noted in a separate color-coded spreadsheet I maintained, because no one had asked me to. It was Bex who texted me first. Did someone send you flowers? My friend works at the same building and said, there's this insane bouquet at your desk. I took a photo and sent it to her. She responded with 6 question mark emojis and, Serena, 1, no idea. Please tell me it's your boss's. I didn't respond to that one. By afternoon I'd half forgotten about the flowers. They sat at the corner of my desk, smelling lovely and minding their business, and I'd returned to the quarterly investor memo I'd been restructuring for 3 days. What I hadn't noticed, because I'd been focused on the memo, was that Stellan had rescheduled 2 calls that afternoon. Both had been on his calendar for weeks. Both were now showing as moved to next week. He'd also walked past my desk 4 times in the span of 2 hours. This was unusual. Stellan Harrow did not pace. He moved with the directional certainty of someone who had already decided where he was going, and resented the distance between here and there. On the 5th pass, he stopped. The Wexford report mentioned the secondary fund disclosure needs updating before the LP meeting. I noted that last Tuesday, I said, not looking up. The updated version is in the shared drive under Wexford Active LPQ3 Prep. I flagged it in the weekly summary on Monday. A pause. You're right, I know. I heard him exhale. Not quite a sigh, not quite amusement, something caught between the two. He started to walk away, then stopped again, Those flowers, does anyone here know who sent them? Now I looked up. I haven't asked around. You're not curious? I'm curious, I said carefully. But I'm also in the middle of restructuring a memo that needs to go out by 4. He looked at me for a moment with that gray-eyed assessment I'd stopped finding intimidating around month 5. Then he turned and walked back into his office, and I watched him pull out his phone before he sat down. He made a call. He kept his voice low, which was unusual. Stellan Harrow generally spoke as though he'd paid for the air in the room and was entitled to use all of it. I turned back to my memo. That evening, as I was gathering my things to leave, Camden, the head of building security, a quietly efficient man I'd always liked, appeared at my desk. Miss Cho, Mr. Harrow asked that you take the flowers home with you tonight. I blinked. Sorry. He wanted them removed from the lobby area. Camden's expression was perfectly neutral in the way that very professional people's expressions are when they've been asked to do something slightly strange and have decided not to comment on it. They're on my desk, I said. Not the lobby. He was specific, the tiniest of pauses. He mentioned there are deliveries sometimes that attract the wrong kind of attention. He said it was a security protocol. I looked at Camden. Camden looked at me. We both understood that this was not, in any meaningful sense, a security protocol. Fine, I said, and picked up the flowers. I was halfway to the elevator when I heard Stellan's voice behind me. He'd come out of his office, jacket on, which meant he was leaving for the evening. Unusual for 7 o'clock. He generally stayed until 9 or 10. Serena. He almost never used my first name. In 2.5 years, it had happened exactly 3 times, and I had noted each occasion the way you note small earthquakes. Not because they were dramatic, because they registered. I turned. He was looking at the flowers in my arms. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully read. Something tightly controlled, deliberate in its containment, like a fire in a glass box. I want to know who sent those, he said quietly. Before you come in tomorrow, you want me to investigate my own flowers. I want to make sure whoever sent them isn't someone we need to be concerned about. He said it without thinking, and then I watched him not take it back. If someone is sending you things without knowing who you are to this firm, he continued, without knowing how visible you are, that's a risk I take seriously. I'm your executive assistant, Mr. Harrow. I'm not particularly visible. You're visible to everyone who walks through that door, he said, and his voice had gone to that quiet place that was somehow louder than when he raised it, which, depending on the week, is half of New York's finance. So yes, I'd like to know. I held his gaze for a moment. Then, I'll look into it. He nodded. He started to walk toward the elevators, then stopped. Good night, Serena. 3 times, now 4. The flowers sat on my kitchen counter that night like a question I didn't know how to answer. I live in a 1-bedroom in the East Village. Not large, not particularly glamorous, but mine, which matters in ways that are hard to articulate when you've spent 3 years sharing walls with strangers. The peonies were too extravagant for the space, honestly. They looked like they'd wandered in from a different life. I found the florist's card tucked beneath the craft paper. Bloom & Quarter, West Village. Premium, not cheap. I texted the number on the card. Hi, I received a delivery today, and I'm trying to find out more about who placed the order. Is there any way to help? They responded almost immediately. It was a Sunday delivery, pre-ordered a week in advance, paid in cash, with instructions to deliver to Serena Cho, Harrow and Vane Capital, 28th floor at 9 a.m. on Thursday. Cash. Pre-ordered. Someone who knew exactly where I worked and exactly what time I arrived. My phone rang. Stellan, his personal cell, the one he'd given me for emergencies. Did you find anything? How did you know I was already looking? Because you don't leave things unresolved. A beat. What did you find? I told him. Cash, advance order, specific timing. He was quiet for a moment. Someone who knows your schedule, or someone who knows the building's delivery windows. They're standard. Don't rationalize it, he said, and his voice had an edge I recognized. Not anger. Something closer to concern wearing anger's clothes. Someone paid attention to you, deliberately. I want to know who. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Serena. The way he said my name made me stop. Quiet, direct. Almost. The way you say someone's name when you've been saying it in your head for a while and it finally has to come out. Lock your door tonight. He hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, peonies on the counter, phone in my hand, trying to figure out when exactly my employer had started knowing the sound of concern. The answer came 3 days later. His name was Pierce Lowell. I didn't know that name when I walked into Stellan's private conference room, used exclusively for meetings that required the kind of discretion the glass-walled main office couldn't provide, and found him standing with 2 printed documents and an expression I'd never seen on him before. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Close the door," he said. "I did. Pierce Lowell sent those flowers." I didn't recognize the name. I said so. Stellan turned. "His father is Garrett Lowell." He paused, as if giving me time to place it. I did. Garrett Lowell ran a mid-size asset management firm out of Boston that had, 3 years ago, been in advanced negotiations with Harrow and Vane for a strategic partnership. The deal had collapsed. I'd started at the firm 6 months after that, but I'd seen the files. It had been ugly. "His son is sending me flowers," I said slowly. "Pierce has been in the city for 4 months. Enrolled in a finance accelerator program at Columbia. Legitimate enough on the surface, but the timing aligns with when someone started making very quiet inquiries about our LP structure." Stellan spread photos across the conference table. Pierce Lowell at a coffee shop I went to on Tuesday mornings. Pierce Lowell at the lobby of a building 2 blocks from mine. "He started watching you in February." The room felt colder. "How do you know all of this?" "Because I've been watching him." He said it simply, factually, as though surveillance of a man surveilling me was a perfectly ordinary executive function. "Since January, when I noticed him at a charity auction where you were organizing the check-in table. He asked about you. 2 specifically. My hands weren't shaking, but they wanted to. You've been having me followed. I've been having him followed." His eyes met mine, steady and unrepentant. "There's a difference. Explain the difference to me." "He doesn't have your best interests in mind. I do." The bluntness of it stopped me, not the words themselves. Stellan Harrow was always direct, but the weight behind them. The way his voice had dropped half a register. "Pierce Lowell isn't trying to ask you out," Stellan continued. "His father lost significant capital in the collapse of that partnership. The firm has been rebuilding for 3 years. Pierce is the kind of man who does things deliberately, and his interest in you started shortly, after he found out that you process our co-investment documentation." The logic arrived cold and clear. He thinks he can get information about Harrow and Vane through me. I know he does. Stellan moved around the table until there were only a few feet between us. "What I don't know is how much he's already learned, not from you, but about you. What he thinks he can offer you, what leverage he believes he has. He doesn't have any leverage. I've never spoken to him. I don't know him." Stellan studied me for a long moment with the same attention he gave to contracts he wasn't yet sure he trusted. Then, "I believe you." The relief I felt at that was disproportionate, and I stored that detail away for later examination. "But he'll try again," Stellan said, "more directly, and I need you to let him." The pause that followed was long enough to be significant. "You want me to meet with him. With appropriate coverage. Monitored. You'll let him believe his approach is working while we document exactly what he's after." Stellan's expression was controlled but not cold. "You've spent 2 years building something here, Serena. You understand this firm's operations better than most people who have titles above yours. That makes you valuable to me. It also, unfortunately, makes you interesting to people like Pierce Lowell." I looked at him. "And if I say no? Then I find another way to handle Pierce Lowell. A more direct way, which tends to get messier and has consequences I'd prefer to avoid." He paused. "But I'm asking you, not ordering you." That distinction, coming from Stellan Harrow, was not a small thing. "I have conditions," I said. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Of course you do. You tell me everything. No managed information, no need to know filtering. If I'm walking into something, I know the whole shape of it." I kept my voice steady. "And after this is over, we talk. About what this actually is. Between us." The silence stretched long enough that I heard the ventilation system hum. "Agreed," he said. "To both." The next 4 days were a compressed education in a world I'd understood theoretically and never encountered directly. Stellan's security team, led by Camden, who turned out to be considerably more than a building security head, briefed me on Pierce Lowell's habits, his known associates, his communication patterns. I learned what wearing a wire looked like when it fit inside the underwire of a regular bra, which is both more and less dramatic than movies suggest. Stellan watched all of it with barely contained tension, interrupting with additional scenarios, edge cases, contingencies. On the third night, when the rest of the team had left, he found me in the conference room studying the surveillance photos. "You could still walk away from this," he said from the doorway. "If I walk away, you handle it your way, which means it gets uglier than it needs to be." I set down a photo. "This is cleaner. There's nothing clean about sending you to meet a man who wants to use you. It's calculated risk. You take those every day. With my own capital." He moved into the room, stopping across the table from me. "Not yours." I looked at him. This man who had once made junior analysts cry by raising a single eyebrow, who had renegotiated a $200 million deal via text message during a 6-hour flight, who had, apparently, been quietly watching over me for months without ever once indicating that I was anything more than a very efficient extension of his executive function. "Why does it matter so much to you?" I asked, genuinely. His hands flattened on the table. "Because you come in every morning, and for approximately the first 10 minutes before the phones start, I can actually think clearly." He said it like it cost him something. "Because you push back when I'm wrong, which almost no one does. Because you fixed the Meridian timeline last March without being asked and saved us from a compliance issue that would have cost us a fund manager and 6 months of goodwill. Because," he stopped, started again, "because you drink terrible tea from the office kitchen, even though I have a perfectly functioning espresso machine 12 feet from your desk, and you do it. Because you don't want to seem like you're taking advantage of the resources available to you, which is both admirable and maddening." He was looking at me now in a way he usually didn't allow himself to. "And somewhere in the last 2.5 years, you became the thing in this office I'm least willing to lose, which is inconvenient for both of us. But it's the truth." I kissed him. He froze for exactly 1 second. Then his hands came up, one at my jaw, one at the back of my neck, and he kissed me back with the controlled intensity of someone who had been deciding not to do exactly this for a very long time. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, both of us breathing a little unevenly. "That was a significant conflict of interest," he said. "I don't care. I'm your employer. I'm aware. There are power dynamics that are, Stellan." I pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I know all of that. I've thought about all of that. I'm still here, standing exactly here, choosing this." I held his gaze. "So can we move past the legal disclaimers?" A sound escaped him. Part exhale, part reluctant laugh. "You're impossible. I'm practical. There's a difference." He kissed me again, shorter this time. Then stepped back and straightened his jacket with the precise movements of a man, reinstalling his composure. "Saturday. Pierce is going to reach out. When he does, you respond. You suggest a public meeting. The new wine bar that opened on Hudson. The one your friend dragged you to last month. How do you know about that?" He didn't answer that. "I'll have people there. You present as conflicted, not convinced. Let him do most of the talking. And you? I'll be close." His expression did something complicated, trying very hard not to make a scene. Pierce Lowell texted that Friday at 4 p.m. Serena. "I've been thinking about our situation a lot. Would love to meet somewhere more private to talk through some things. Saturday our situation. As though we had one. As though those flowers had established something between us that I'd agreed to." I showed Stellan. His jaw tightened. Text him back. "The wine bar, 7 o'clock. Public, crowded, on your terms." Saturday evening. Pierce Lowell turned out to be exactly as calculated as advertised. Good-looking in a forgettable way. Carefully casual clothing that was expensive enough to signal ambition and relaxed enough to signal confidence. He stood when I arrived, smiled like we were already friends. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I was worried my approach might have been too unconventional." "The flowers were beautiful," I said, and sat down. "But I still don't know why you sent them." He laughed softly. "Honestly? Because I've been in New York for 4 months, and you're the first person I've seen who actually looks like she knows what she's doing." "How do you know what I look like doing anything?" A small pause. "I did my research. You work for Stellan Harrow. That's a demanding position. His reputation isn't exactly warm." "His reputation is accurate," I said carefully. "He's demanding. He's also fair." "Fair?" Pierce smiled like I'd made a small joke. "That's a generous description of a man whose decisions have left a trail of people significantly worse off than they started. You seem to know a lot about him. My father was one of those people. The pleasantness in his voice stayed exactly the same, which made it somehow colder. 3 years ago, Harrow and Vane walked away from an agreement at the worst possible moment. Cost my father's firm 18 months of runway and 2 major clients. He rebuilt, but it took everything we had. I watched him. And you think I can help you do something about that? Something shifted in his face, a brief recalibration, a decision made. I think you see everything that crosses Stellan Harrow's desk. Every deal, every LP communication, every co-investment. And I think someone in your position, working as hard as you work, might occasionally wonder if what you're getting in return is proportional to what you're giving. He tilted his head. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. Just to help me understand how he operates, his priorities, his vulnerabilities. There it was. I took a slow breath, let the silence sit for a moment, then, you're asking me to betray someone who trusts me, in exchange for compensation and the framing that it's justified by your family's losses. Pierce blinked. Just once. I'm offering you a chance to be fairly compensated for information that… No. I set down my glass. I'm going to be honest with you, Pierce, because I think you're smart enough to appreciate honesty more than a performance. I know exactly what you've been doing. I know you've been in New York since January. I know about the coffee shop on Bleecker and the building 2 blocks from mine. I watched his face go very still, and I know that this dinner is being recorded. The door of the private dining room opened. Stellan walked in. Behind him, a woman I recognized from the firm's legal team, and beside her, 2 people in FBI credentials that I had not, in fact, been expecting. Pierce went white. Mr. Lowell. The taller of the 2 federal agents stepped forward. We've been monitoring communications related to an investigation into improper solicitation of confidential business information. We'd like you to come with us. As they led him out, Pierce looked back at me, something between fury and disbelief. You set me up. You set yourself up, I said. I just kept the appointment. The room emptied, and then it was just Stellan and me in the small, overly elegant dining room, and I became aware of how tightly I'd been holding myself for the past 2 hours. My shoulders dropped approximately 2 inches. He crossed to me. His hands came to my face, tilting it up, checking me the way you check someone after something hard. You're okay. I'm okay. I exhaled. Did you know the FBI was going to be here? I knew there was an active inquiry into Pierce's activities that extended beyond what he tried with you. The U.S. Attorney's Office was already building a case. This gave them what they needed. He paused. I would have told you, but I wasn't certain until this morning. That's one thing we're going to work on, I said. The telling me part. His mouth curved. I assumed. The weeks that followed were quieter, and then not. Pierce Lowell's arrest surfaced enough about his activities that 2 other firms contacted Harrow and Vane about patterns they'd noticed. There were depositions, long calls with legal, the kind of administrative aftermath that is deeply unglamorous and absolutely necessary. Through it all, Stellan and I navigated something new, something that didn't quite have a name yet, that existed in the particular tension between a professional relationship and everything we'd admitted to each other. We were careful. We were also, quietly, inevitable. 3 months after the wine bar, he came to find me at the end of a long Tuesday, when the office had emptied and the city had gone dark and golden outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he sat on the edge of my desk, something he had never done before, in 2 years and 10 months, and looked at me with an expression he didn't bother to armor. I want to talk about what comes next, he said. Professionally or otherwise? Otherwise. He held my gaze. I've been thinking about the power imbalance. You've been thinking about it too, I know. And I want to be honest with you about something, okay? I've been using it as a reason to hold back, telling myself it was ethical caution. He paused. It wasn't entirely ethical caution. Some of it was fear. The last time I let someone's mattered this much, He stopped, started over. I'm not good at this part. The being known part. I know. You know, he repeated, and something in the way he said it, like I'd already arrived somewhere he was still finding his way to, made his expression change. What do I do with that? You stop treating the fear like evidence, I said. And you just stay. That's it. That's the whole thing. He was quiet for a moment. The city hummed below us. 41 floors of accumulated history and calculated decisions and very carefully maintained distance, and him sitting on my desk like he'd finally decided the distance wasn't worth what it was costing. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about the partnership collapse with Garrett Lowell. Tell me." So he did, all of it. Not the version in the files, the real version. Garrett Lowell had been running money that didn't belong to him through intermediary funds, using client capital to cover positions that were months underwater. Stellan had discovered it during due diligence. He'd walked away from the deal and reported what he found to the relevant regulatory bodies, which had triggered an investigation that cost Lowell Capital 2 of its largest institutional clients. Pierce had grown up watching his father blame Stellan for years of consequences that were, in fact, his father's own. "You didn't ruin his firm," I said slowly. "You refused to participate in something that would have eventually ruined it more thoroughly, and yours along with it. The outcome for them was the same. The intent wasn't." He held my gaze. "I need you to know the difference, because you're choosing to be here, and you should choose with accurate information." I thought about that for a moment. About the difference between the story Pierce had been told and the story that was true. About how two versions of the same event could produce entirely different people, aimed in entirely different directions. "I'm still here," said, "even knowing that I operate in spaces that aren't entirely clean. That the firm's early capital came from relationships I'd build differently now, knowing what I know. Knowing that you've spent 15 years building something that operates by rules, even when the world around it doesn't." I held his gaze. "Yes, still here." He pulled me into his arms then, and it felt different from all the moments before this one. Not urgent, not controlled, just certain. We transitioned carefully. I moved into a consulting role, still working with Harrow and Vane as a primary client, but independently. I built 2 other client relationships in my first 3 months. It was terrifying and exactly right, and Stellan never once suggested I take the easier path. He pushed me toward the harder one, which turned out to be one of the clearest things he could have done. There were complications, there always are. A rival firm that caught wind of my relationship with Stellan and attempted to use it as leverage in a deal negotiation, which backfired spectacularly when I documented their approach, and Stellan's legal team made the documentation public. Associates who questioned his judgment. A profile piece in a financial publication that framed our relationship in terms I found reductive and he found inaccurate, and we both found irritating enough to decline commenting on. We handled them. Together, which was what I had asked for. 9 months after the wine bar, on a Sunday morning when the light was coming in sideways through his apartment windows, and he was making coffee badly. He maintained the most expensive espresso machine available and still produced mediocre results, which I found inexplicably endearing. He said something without looking up from what he was doing. "I've been thinking about permanence." I looked at him from across the kitchen island. That's a very Stellan Harrow way to introduce a topic. "I'm thinking about what I want our life to look like in 10 years. He turned. His expression was open in a way I'd learned to recognize, the way it looked when he'd already decided something, and was checking whether the other person had arrived at the same place. "And I want you in it. Specifically, not adjacently, not in a way that has qualifiers or contingencies." "Are you?" I paused. "Are you asking me to marry you, or are you describing a long-term strategic objective?" The corner of his mouth lifted. "Can it be both?" I set down my coffee, crossed the kitchen to where he was standing, looked at him, this complicated, careful, fiercely loyal, frequently maddening person who had watched over me before I'd known I needed watching over, who had told me the truth when he could have told me the easier version, who sat on my desk when he'd run out of reasons not to. "Yes," I said. He exhaled, and it was such a specific kind of exhale, relief wearing the shape of a person who'd been holding something a very long time and had finally carefully put it down. "Good." He took my face in his hands. "Because I've been carrying that question around for 3 months, and I've been terrible company. You're always somewhat terrible company. It's part of the appeal." He kissed me, and I thought about how every part of this had looked like something else from the outside. A professional relationship, a problem to be solved, a danger to be navigated. How you couldn't tell, from a single frame of it, what it actually was, which was a choice. Every morning, renewed, two people deciding, with full information and clear eyes, that the complicated version was worth more than the simple version could ever be. We got married the following spring. Small ceremony, city hall, dinner after at a restaurant that didn't take reservations. Stellan had called in a favor, which I told him defeated the spirit of the thing, and he told me was just efficient. Our friends laughed. I laughed. He didn't laugh, but he smiled in that particular way he had, the one that was somehow more than laughing. Bex cried. Camden shook Stellan's hand with the expression of someone who has professionally protected a person for years, and is genuinely glad they turned out to be worth the effort, and I stood in the middle of a life I had built, with a person I had chosen, knowing the whole shape of him, the shadows and the commitments, the places he was still learning to trust, and the places he was unshakably certain, and understood that this was what it felt like when you get to keep the thing you didn't realize you were hoping for. Not easy, not simple, just real, and mine, and worth every careful, complicated step that had led us here.